On a hot May day in 1996, a car bomb detonates in a Delhi marketplace. It's a small bomb, it wouldn't make our news, but it is fatal for two kids who are 11 and 13. They are killed, and it has a massive impact on their family and friends. So begins the novel, The Association of Small Bombs. And the narrator says in the novel, when things are good, you can see no other way of living. When things are in ruins, there appears a million solutions for how this fate could have been avoided. When things are good, you can see no other way of living. I wonder, is the world we live in good? It seems to me that what dominates is war, terrorism, revenge. That's normal, that's the order of our day. And accompanying these actions is a story that we hear again and again. When you are under attack, whether that's physical attack or emotional attack, you should attack back. Use your words to stop someone, use force, use violence. In fact, if we do that, that's how justice will come about, through violence. That's how good will win. Like, think of all the epic stories and movies. They're always about good triumphing, and how do they do it? They have a big battle. My niece at the moment is obsessed with Star Wars. So I'm learning a lot about Star Wars. But once we watch the movies, then we play it out. It's pretty typical of kids, like, right, ready to get your lightsaber, and like, and then, of course, whoever is Darth Vader must be defeated. That's the way the story goes. Although the other way you can play this game, if you're 5, is that Darth Vader falls in love and gets married and comes to the good side. So you can either use violence or romance. That's kind of the two big narratives, right? But I think kids, like, very early on, learn how to fight or pretend fight with one another, because it's not long before they're watching the news or they glance on the news and they see, hey, adults, they fight with one another. They tell us not to fight. Like, when we fight, they say, no, don't hit one another. But adults fight. Adults do violence to one another. We have adults driving cars into people on the streets. We have other adults going with guns into schools, killing people. The world we live in is a dangerous place. And not just, way out there in other countries, but even in little old Hornsby, last year there was a spate of violence. You might remember the story of an ex-husband stabbing his ex-wife at a restaurant while she was on a date. And then a few months later, there was a man with a knife in Hornsby Westfield that had to be shot by the police. So even in Hornsby, violence happens. And even in our schools, violence happens. Every Monday, I meet up with a group of kids to talk about Jesus during their lunchtime. And a lot of these kids that come are kids who don't quite fit in. That's probably why they're here, to talk about Jesus during their lunchtime. And they share about how they're being bullied, how other kids come at them with sticks, how other kids exclude them because they don't quite fit in. And their response is to want to fight back. It's to want to attack, because that's the story we are told. We are told to attack. We are told that is how justice will happen. Until Jesus came along and threw a bombshell right in the middle of our stories. Jesus, as we've been seeing on the Sermon on the Mount, keeps reframing the stories that we think we know, and he turns them upside down. He shakes them and he says, no. There's another way to live. Jesus is talking about the kingdom of God. He says, the kingdom of God is coming. God's reign is coming. You are all welcome. Receive God's grace. And now I'm going to tell you, this is how you to live. If you're a citizen of God's kingdom, I'm calling you to this way of life. And it is a way that you've never heard of before. And it is a way you might sometimes think is incredibly difficult. But this is the way that God calls us to, and it is good. So Jesus begins first by stating the old story. Let's begin with what you know. This is the old story. You have heard that it was said, eye for eye and tooth for tooth. Revenge and violence. That's how the story works. And it makes sense. When something bad happens to you, like everything that Jesus has been previously talking about, when that goes wrong, like if you have someone in your family who's murdered, or if someone insults you, or if someone is unfaithful in marriage, or if someone breaks their vows or lies to you, like you might have experienced that. If someone lies to you or insults you, it hurts. And what do? You want to lash out. You want them to feel what you have done. You want justice to happen. Recently, one of the masterminds for the Bali terrorist bombings was finally charged. Back in the early 2000s it happened. He was finally charged. And they were interviewing families who had lost loved ones. And they said exactly this: we want justice. We want the death penalty. That man should suffer like we have suffered. That's our natural instinct. In fact, some people think it's actually wired into our brains. There's scientists at the University of Kentucky who were looking at aggression, and that led them to studying revenge. And they noticed that when you feel like something unfair has happened to you, when things are not right, whether you've been shamed, when you've been made to feel less than, or whether you're physically under threat, your brain goes, you must respond by protecting yourself. So you lash out. You want that other person to suffer like you have suffered, like they have made you suffer. And once they have, your brain rewards you. It goes, yes, you've protected yourself. You can feel pleasure and satisfaction. Like, it literally can feel good to get revenge, at least in the moment. Like, you temporarily like, yes. And then you might feel guilty afterwards. And that kind of makes sense, because when you look at our world, like, there's all these cycles of revenge and retaliation and revenge and retaliation. We see it on the big global scale, like, if you bomb me, I'm going to bomb you. We have these, like, talks between North Korea and America, like, who's the bigger person who can be aggressive. We see it with terrorists, like, terrorists strike here, run over some people, and someone retaliates and runs over some people near a mosque. And we see it on the personal level. Your boss is unfair to you at work, and then you can badmouth your boss because that's only right. Like, that boss treated you unfairly. Now I'm going to badmouth the boss. Or someone in your family is rude to you, and like, I'm going to punish you. I'm not going to speak to you. I'm going to give you the silent treatment until you realise that what you have done was wrong, until you have suffered. That's the way we work. And in fact, it works into this narrative that Walter Wink calls redemptive violence. There's this belief that if we are violent, if we're aggressive, somehow justice will come. And that's what a lot of our movies say. You have the battle, and then whoever is stronger wins. And Walter Wink says that this is actually the spirituality of our age. He says, violence is the spirituality of the modern world. It has been accorded the status of a religion, demanding from its devotees an absolute obedience to death. So in ancient Israel, God gave this code that Jesus is now quoting. So this is the code that Israel was to live by. And the purpose of the code was to rein in this impulse that we have towards revenge. So it's trying to say, how can we, if a crime has been committed, how can we make sure that we respond appropriately so that the punishment or the response in some way corresponds to the crime? The temptation is to go in excess. Like, especially if you're the victim, you're like, I want the death penalty. I want the worst punishment you can think of because that's how hurt I've been. Our temptation is to go overboard. So God, understanding this, limits it. He places limits. He wants to make sure that the crime happens and that the response links into the crime and that there's a limit. There's an end to it. So you can find this reference in Exodus 21 and Deuteronomy 19:21. Now, I think it's a pretty good, sensible law. In fact, I think a lot of our laws are still trying to work out how can we make sure that we're responding in a way that links into the crime, that's appropriate. That's always what we're wrestling with. And even when we talk about war, we talk often about limits. I don't know if we always follow them, but we say, civilians shouldn't get killed, that's bad, or we shouldn't use chemical warfare. So we've written international agreements about what we think is excessive. So limits are important, and that's what this code was designed for. But in Jesus' day, and this is hard for us to understand because this might not be our experience, but in Jesus' day, the Jewish people were pretty angry. They were living under an oppressive regime where there was a lot of injustice and where they felt powerless. And the only way they thought they could solve it was to resort to violence. Like, if we just rebel violently, maybe we'll be free. Now, it wasn't very successful because the Romans would come in even stronger. And so Jesus is saying this cycle isn't actually going to give you freedom. It isn't going to set you free. In fact, if you do not change, you're going to be decimated. And that's what happened to Israel in the end. In AD 70, they were decimated by the Romans. Is there another way? How do you break this cycle of retaliation and revenge? And how do you see that justice is done? It's a big question in our world today, because if you look at so many countries and ethnic groups, they're stuck in this cycle of revenge and wanting justice. And even in our personal lives, revenge is almost acceptable. Like if someone breaks up with you, it's okay to post intimate pictures online. Like revenge porn is a thing now, because you can get back at them for how they've hurt you, for breaking up with you. If someone breaks up with you, you can insult them and say derogatory things about them because you're in pain. Or even in your family, like if someone insults you, especially extended family, suddenly we don't talk to that side of the family anymore. And maybe several generations have gone by and you can't even remember why you don't talk to them. But it's everywhere, these cycles of violence and revenge and retaliation. How do you break the cycle? Well, Jesus says, somewhat surprisingly, "But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also." So some scholars, like Strusson and Gushee, have argued, and if you want to know the technical details, you can speak to me later, that this is better translated as "do not retaliate by evil means" instead of "do not resist an evil person." And I'll explain why they argue this. Do not resist an evil person suggests a very passive response, like no matter what is happening, no matter how evil, you just do nothing. But when we look at Jesus, that's not what Jesus does. Jesus does resist what is evil. He stands up against the Pharisees. He resisted Satan. But the different thing is that he doesn't engage in revengeful violence. He doesn't use evil means. How he responds is unexpected. And so as people who are trying to follow Jesus, the same applies to us. I think Jesus calls us to participate in justice. Jesus calls us to resist evil, but the way we do it is to be unexpected. And the first unexpected move that Jesus says is turn the other cheek. If you're going to be slapped on the right cheek, with your left, it's normally with your left hand, you slap someone on the right cheek. That was something that was considered like a really bad insult. And it was reserved for like a slave owner would slap his slave, or a Roman soldier would slap a peasant. So someone who was powerful would insult someone who was powerless with a left hand. Now, in Jesus' day, the left hand was considered unclean. It was considered dirty. So it was even a more of an insult to be slapped with the left hand. What do you do in that situation? Like you're pretty powerless, you're a slave or a peasant, and your master slaps you. Jesus says, turn the other cheek. Now that's a surprising move. The person would be like, what? What are you doing? But by turning the other cheek, it's not simply, oh, be passive, keep hitting me, keep slapping me. It's actually reminding the person that you are a person made in the image of God. And if you're going to slap me on my cheek of inferiority, could you please slap me on my cheek of equality? I am a person in the image of God, and I want to remind you of that as you slap me, so that it surprises the person, so it catches them off guard, and maybe even leads to them repenting and going, oh, I shouldn't have done that, I'm sorry. It's transforming the cycle of injustice by making this startling move. And this type of thinking, this transforming initiative, continues in the rest of this section. And if anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, hand over your coat as well. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2 miles. Give to the one who asks you, and do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you. Again, we need to remember Jesus' context. He's talking primarily to people who are powerless and poor. If you go to the court system and the court says, we demand your outer coat, Jesus says, give the inner garment, which effectively means you are going out of court naked. Now, to go out of court naked in Jesus' day, as in our day, is illegal. You can't go wandering around the streets with no clothes on. But if you're going out of court naked, like if people actually did this, then the public would see, oh my goodness, something is seriously wrong with the court system. It is cruel, it is unjust, it is corrupt if it would allow a poor person to leave without any clothes. So it's a startling move that kind of exposes injustice. In fact, if people actually did this, soldiers and judges could be arrested for allowing someone to have no clothes. It's breaking injustice, but in a creative way. So when you think of, like, how does this work in practice? Does people, like, I can't even imagine. What would this look like in practice? It took people a long time to think through and actually take Jesus' words seriously. And one of the first people that comes to mind who actually did was a non-Christian. Gandhi started putting these words into practice when he was fighting against injustice in India. He started using non-violent action to bring about justice. And then Martin Luther King was like, oh, this is really powerful. This can change things. I'm going to take these ideas. I'm going to go back to the Sermon on the Mount. And then he started applying it in a totally different context in his fight for making sure that black people had equality in America. And so what they would do, you probably heard the stories, but when they came to protest and the police came with their dogs and their fire hoses, the protesters did not resist. And they did not resist, and the people, like the cameras filmed them, and then the public saw the injustice that was happening. It was exposed. And it shamed people, and people began to recognize, hang on, I didn't realize this was a problem, but this is a massive problem that we need to change. And so it breaks the cycle of injustice. A more recent example, in 2002 there was civil war in Ghana. And a woman, a Christian Lima, had this vision of God calling her to pray for peace. There's been a civil war between this Christian president and a Muslim opposition. So she intentionally met with a Muslim woman and she said, let's get together and we're going to pray. And they gathered other women from mosques and churches and markets, and they actually sat in the marketplace and occupied this space, calling for peace, calling for an end to the civil war by praying, not using any violence. And they said, we are sick of being raped, we are sick of this war, we are sick of our children being killed. In 2003, the civil war ended, and they were recognised as playing a significant role in that peace process. In fact, they were awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. Jesus' words, when taken seriously, can literally stop wars, transform nations. The last example I have is from last year. So America still has tensions with its African American community. You might have heard of a black man being shot by police, and it caused a lot of protests. And so again, they go back out to protest. They're looking at Martin Luther King's ideas again, and there's this picture taken of this woman. It went viral. Millions of people viewed it. Because it's, again, this vulnerability, this person coming completely vulnerable up against people with armour, ready to fight back. And she's saying, I'm grieving because what happened to this man wasn't right. But I'm not going to use aggression to make this point. Jesus' way is powerful in breaking injustice, particularly if you're feeling powerless. The last example that Jesus moved, which is talking to people who feel powerless, is he says, if a Roman soldier forces you to go 1 mile, which legally he could, particularly, again, poor people, carry my heavy pack, walk 1 mile, offer to go 2. And by doing that, 2 things happen. Firstly, if you feel powerless, sometimes you can feel like you're a victim. I have no choice here, I'm stuck. But Jesus says, make the choice. You always have a choice. So assert your personal agency. You are a person made in the image of God. Decide, okay, you know what, I'm going to help you, and I'm going to go 2 miles. And also, I think it's a rather subversive move, because you know when someone is really frustrating you or angry and you suddenly show extraordinary kindness to that person? Like when that happens to me, when I'm angry at someone and someone shows me love, I often feel really guilty for feeling angry to them, and it makes me repent. So this person suddenly goes, oh, I'd love to carry your pack, let's go 2 miles. That's not what you expect them to do. It's a bombshell move that can break the cycle of injustice and offer another way forward. Because when we think about justice, it's not just about making sure things are fair, but it's about trying to get up to a place of people repenting and reconciling with one another. Now, for those of us who feel like, well, I don't really feel powerless, maybe these strategies would work if I was powerless, but, you know, I'm actually quite wealthy. I'm actually quite powerful. Jesus also has a word for those of us who feel that way. He says, if you feel powerful and if you are wealthy, don't use your power and wealth to get even at other people. Don't use it to hoard up your wealth and protect yourself. Break the cycle of injustice through generosity. When you see what's happening in the world today, there is so much inequality. There's such a big gap between the rich and the poor. And no wonder that leads to tensions and violence and revenge and terrorism. But if people gave generously, imagine if everyone gave generously, that could transform whole people groups, whole countries. So Jesus says, be generous. Use your wealth to bless others. Lend to others. And it can start really small. The youth group, maybe, 10 years ago, some of the youth girls, I think Lauren and Joe came up with it, used to do a thing called love bombing, where they would pick someone randomly to bless. So it could be the police, it could be the hospital, it could be older people in our church. You'd be surprised, and the girls would come and they'd bring things to give to these people, and then they'd love bomb them and go to those places to bless them. I think that's what Jesus is talking about. It's so small, but imagine if we had more love bombs instead of real bombs. That can change things. Jesus says we are to resist evil. We're not to be passive and do nothing, but how we do it matters. The end does not justify the means matter. So how we do it is really important. We are to be people who, as much as we can, respond in a non-violent way. And we do so with the help of God. Now, some of us might be thinking, that sounds really foolish. That doesn't work in the real world. That doesn't happen. Like, how can you do that? And in fact, most of the church has kind of ignored this part of the sermon about since the 4th century when the church made an alliance with Constantine. We're like, we're with the state now, and of course the state loves violence and war. The church has kind of ignored this part of the teaching and gone, let's go back to the Old Testament. We like the Old Testament. It seems like foolishness. And in fact, I find these words really confronting. This is Jesus' vision for God's kingdom, and it collides with our instincts and our powers and our stories. In fact, it offended people so much that they wanted to kill Jesus. And so Jesus actually had to live this out. When they came to arrest Jesus, Peter responded as our natural instinct. He grabs his sword, he's like, I'm ready to fight for you, Jesus. Cuts off the servant's ear, and Jesus is like, put your weapons away. He heals the servant's ear, and he says, no, I'm gonna go through this. He allows himself to be arrested, he allows himself to be beaten and insulted. But it's not a passive thing. Jesus deliberately chooses to do this. And he's crucified on the cross. And one of the things that happens first and foremost is that the powers in this world who think that they control things through violence is exposed. They have no power. They have no power against the God who can raise people from the dead. What also is exposed is the idea that violence leads to salvation. No, that's not the way. At the cross, revenge is dealt with. Sin is dealt with, justice is dealt with. God does care about justice, but God says, let me deal with it, and I deal it on the cross so that both the victim and the perpetrator might be free, might be called to live this way of the cross. Christians are called to take up our cross and follow Jesus. And Jesus did all this out of a deep sense of love. Yes, justice matters, and it's important that wrongs are addressed. But even more important, I think, to God is this deep sense of love. How can God be reconciled to people? God is interested in bringing justice and grace together. So Jesus does all this, and he instructs Christians to do all these actions because he wants ultimately to lead people to a place of love. The old view goes, you've heard that it was said, love your neighbour and hate your enemy. This doesn't quite come from the Old Testament. Love your neighbour does come from the Old Testament, it's in the Torah, but hate your enemy is never said in the Torah. I think over time people just automatically assumed, well, love your neighbour and hate your enemy. That's what God, of course, means. So you work out, who is my neighbour? And we're very good at working out who is our neighbour. It's like my family, my ethnic tribe, my nation, maybe my gender, class, sexual orientation, political persuasion, age, like whatever. We can divide over lots of stuff. So you work out who it is and go, they are my neighbours, and everyone else I'm indifferent to, or worse, hostile to. That's the way that we work. That's not the way God works. Jesus says, I know that you'll have enemies. There are people that are going to frustrate you, that you're going to hate. There are people who might be unfair to you. But you're not to fight fire with fire. You're not to hate them as they hate you. I'm calling you to a different kind of love. If you love those who love you, what reward will you get? Are not even the tax collectors doing that? And if you greet only your own people, what are you doing more than others? Do not even pagans do that? We can overwhelm our enemies with love because that is what God has done. We who are enemies from God have experienced incredible love through Jesus. And when we've experienced that love, we become free to love people in the way of Jesus. We know that justice has been dealt with and we leave justice into the hands of God. We trust that God will deal with justice. And we're prepared to take these sometimes incredibly hard, creative steps because we know we worship the God who raises people from the dead. And so we don't just like the people who like us, we are called to a different kind of love. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be children of your Father in heaven. He causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. Our Father in heaven loves all people. He gives good indiscriminately. He wants to reconcile with his enemies. That's who the God is that we claim to worship. Hate comes really easily to us. It comes naturally. But Jesus calls us to a different way. And he says, if you can love even your enemies, that's the thing that's going to really break this cycle of revenge. If you can be reconciled with your enemy. And so I think we need to hear more stories of this because it's easy to hear stories of violence and revenge. But we need to hear more stories of the opposite. In 2014, terrorism came to Sydney at the Lindt Cafe. And it was a really hard time for a lot of people. A lot of people were really moved, placing flowers at Martin Square. But two things, at least that I saw happen, that showed me that there's another way to respond. First, there was the Ride With Me campaign. So some Muslims are feeling like they were under attack after the terrorism attack. And so this, I think it was through Twitter, campaign started saying, if you feel like that you are afraid to get on the train, you can ride with me. I'm like, that's such a beautiful gesture. That's what Jesus is talking about, that we're going to sit with people who we might not always agree with on everything, or we might have very different values, but I want to love them, and I'm going to make sure that they're safe. The other person that is really inspiring is this woman named Louisa Hope. So she's a 52-year-old woman, a Christian, who was in the siege and was shot in the foot. And during that whole siege, she was praying to God during that situation. And after she was freed, she got all these donations from people. She didn't take any of the money for herself. She wanted to give it away to those more in need. And everyone kept asking her, well, have you forgiven the terrorist? And this is her response. I totally understand that it would be the most natural reaction to fear and loathe and hate that man. But it's of absolutely no value to myself or anyone around me if I indulge that reaction or feeling. When people say often, do you forgive him? I'm like, well, I never hated him to start with, to have to go through the process of forgiving. I can't kind of fluff my way through an answer and say, yes, I forgive him, because I never allowed myself to hate him in the first place. When I hear stuff like that, I'm like, I hope if I was in such a situation, I'd respond with such grace. That instinct doesn't come naturally. It's one that we need the Holy Spirit to cultivate. And Jesus gives us the clue to how you cultivate it. How can you be ready for when an enemy comes or when injustice comes to you? How can you be ready to be able to respond with such grace? Jesus' bombshell move is simple. Pray. It's small. No one's going to notice it, but it is powerful. It can change the world. And as you start to pray for your enemies, it's a really strange experience because it comes a lot harder to hate them as you are praying for them, depending on what you're praying. We want to be praying for good stuff for them. So if you're praying for blessings and good stuff, your heart begins to change. You begin to see that person in a different way. You begin to remember that they are a person made in the image of God who also deserves to be reconciled. In a world where there is a lot of revenge and violence, and it seems like an intensification of hatred, we need to hear Jesus' words more than ever. There is another way to live. There's another way to respond. And it begins with us bringing it all to God. So we're going to spend some time in prayer now, praying for people who we might struggle with, who we might consider our enemies. James Bryan Smith says that often we don't have enemies. So I'm going to give you a moment to think about who are your competitors. If you can't think of enemies, like if you have enemies, like write them down. But you're like, oh, I like everybody. Think about the people who you compete with. Sometimes even churches, we can compete with one another, different denominations. Write it down. So I'm going to give you space now to write down as many people that you would class as an enemy or competitor, someone that frustrates you, someone that dislikes, or it could be not just individuals, but organisations. Like this week, bureaucracy, government bureaucracy sometimes. That was really frustrating me this week. So it can be an institution. It can be the church. Maybe you hate the church. But write it down, and then I'm going to lead you through the rest of the prayer. So let me give you a moment to write or pray. Who are people that you find really difficult to love?